Harlem, New York City, August 1934. An Italian numbers runner sits down at an illegal poker table on West 139th Street, flush with cash and overconfident. Across from him sits Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a rising enforcer in the city's most lucrative underground lottery operation. The stakes are high thousands of dollars changing hands in a smoke-filled basement where territorial boundaries blur and old-world racism collides with the new economics of organized crime. Then, sometime after midnight, witnesses report the Italian player loses a hand. He loses his temper. He uses a racial slur, the most vicious epithet imaginable, directed at Johnson. The room goes silent. Johnson stands. The Italian is escorted outside by dawn sanitation workers discover his remains in 3 separate locations across Manhattan, his torso in a Chelsea alley, one leg floating near the docks, the other discarded in a Bronx lot. No arrests are made, no witnesses come forward, and by morning the city understood this wasn't a bluff. This is a reconstructed account based on public reporting, historical records, and widely circulated accounts from the era of Prohibition's twilight and Harlem's numbers wars. Some details vary across sources. Eyewitness testimony from illegal gambling dens was rarely committed to official record, and newspaper coverage of black organized crime in 1934 was often sensationalized, incomplete, or deliberately obscured by police corruption. What follows is our best effort to piece together the inciting incident, the escalation, the power structures at play, and the question that gripped New York's underworld for weeks afterward: had Bumpy Johnson just declared war on the Italian Mafia? The basement poker game on the night of August 14th was not supposed to be a flashpoint. According to multiple accounts, it was a neutral ground game, one of dozens operating nightly in Harlem, where black operators, Jewish bookmakers, and Italian muscle occasionally crossed paths to gamble, trade information, and test boundaries. The room was controlled by a local numbers banker named Casper Holstein's associate, a man known only as Big Charlie, who enforced a strict no-violence policy at the table. Cash only, no weapons visible, no disputes that couldn't be settled with cards. Bumpy Johnson arrived around 10:30 that night, reportedly accompanied by 2 associates. He was 30 years old, just returned from a stint upstate, and already building a reputation as the muscle behind Stephanie St. Clair, the notorious Queenie who ran the largest independent numbers operation in Harlem. Johnson's presence at the table was unusual. He was not known as a gambler. Observers later told police he seemed to be there for business collecting, observing, perhaps sending a message that St. Clair's network was expanding. The Italian player, identified in later reports only as Frankie C, was allegedly connected to the Luciano organization, the rapidly consolidating Italian syndicate that was beginning to eye Harlem's numbers rackets with predatory interest. Frankie was loud, brash, drinking heavily, and winning steadily until just after midnight. Then the cards turned. Johnson took 3 consecutive hands. Frankie's stack dwindled. Witnesses reported he became belligerent, accused Johnson of cheating, and demanded the dealer reshuffle. Big Charlie intervened, inspecting the deck. No evidence of tampering. The game continued. Johnson won again, a pot estimated at nearly $2,000, a staggering sum in Depression-era America. Frankie exploded. He stood, knocked over his chair, and launched into a tirade. According to every account that survives, he used the most offensive racial language imaginable, repeatedly, specifically targeting Johnson with a slur that, even in 1934 Harlem, crossed an unforgivable line. The room froze. One witness later recalled, "You could hear every man breathing. Nobody moved. Bumpy didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Frankie. like he was already dead. Johnson reportedly said only 3 words, "Take him outside." 2 men later identified as Johnson's associates escorted Frankie toward the door. He resisted briefly, shouting threats about Italian retaliation, invoking the names of powerful mobsters. Big Charlie made no effort to intervene. The unwritten rules of the underworld were clear. A public insult of that magnitude, in that setting, forfeited all protections. Frankie had not merely disrespected Johnson, he had disrespected every black operator in the room, challenged their right to sit at the table, and implied that white, specifically Italian criminals held inherent authority over Harlem's own people. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Frankie was gone, not missing gone, his body dismembered with what investigators later described as professional efficiency, appeared in 3 locations before sunrise. The message was unmistakable and deliberate. Disrespect has consequences. Geography has owners. And Bumpy Johnson was not a man to be insulted. The question now was whether the Italians would answer. Friday, August 15, 6:20 a.m. A sanitation worker on West 24th Street in Chelsea discovers a human torso wrapped in burlap behind a shuttered warehouse. No identification. The head and limbs are missing. Police are summoned. The body is transported to the city morgue. Initial examination suggests the victim was killed elsewhere, no blood at the scene, and dismembered with a sharp, heavy blade, possibly a cleaver or industrial saw. Friday, 9:45 a.m., a dock worker at Pier 57 reports a severed leg floating near a cargo ship. Harbor police retrieve it. The limb shows signs of recent amputation, clean cuts indicating post-mortem dismemberment. The medical examiner begins comparing tissue samples to the Chelsea torso. Friday, 12:30 p.m. The second leg is discovered in a trash heap in the South Bronx, wrapped in newspaper dated August 13th. A neighborhood boy alerts police. By early afternoon, the medical examiner confirms all 3 parts belong to the same victim, a white male, mid-30s, approximately 5'9", well-fed, with no distinguishing scars. Fingerprints are taken but yield no immediate matches in police files. Friday, 4 p.m., word spreads through Harlem's underworld. Multiple sources report the victim was the Italian gambler from the previous night's poker game. No official confirmation from police, but street-level operators begin closing shops early, canceling appointments, and moving money out of vulnerable locations. The assumption is simple: retaliation is coming. Friday, 7:15 p.m. A Harlem numbers runner is stopped by 2 Italian men in a black sedan on Lenox Avenue. They ask for Bumpy Johnson's location. The runner claims ignorance. The Italians leave without violence, but the message is clear: they are searching, and they are not hiding it. Word reaches Stephanie St. Clair within the hour. Saturday, August 16 to 1 a.m., an Italian-owned speakeasy in East Harlem is firebombed. No casualties, but the building is gutted. Police arrive to find no witnesses and no suspects. Neighborhood residents refuse to speak. The ownership traces back to a Luciano associate. Investigators suspect retaliation for Frankie's death, but no evidence links the attack to Johnson or St. Clair's network. Accounts differ. Saturday, 8:30 a.m., the New York Police Department's 6th Precinct issues a terse statement acknowledging the discovery of dismembered remains, but declines to identify the victim or speculate on motive. No suspects are named. A reporter from the Amsterdam News, Harlem's leading black newspaper, is told off the record that this is a gangland matter, and we expect it to resolve itself. Saturday, 11 a.m., Bumpy Johnson is reportedly seen entering the Radium Club, a known gathering spot for Stephanie St. Clair's organization, accompanied by at least 6 armed men. Observers note he appears calm, even relaxed. He stays inside for less than 30 minutes, then departs in a different vehicle. His movements suggest either confidence or preparation for siege. Saturday, 2:45 p.m. A delegation of Italian mobsters, 3 men in expensive suits, arrives at a Harlem church where Casper Holstein, the respected elder statesman of the numbers game, is known to conduct informal arbitrations. They request a meeting. Holstein refuses. The Italians leave peacefully but issue a warning through an intermediary, Frankie had friends. This isn't over. Saturday, 6 p.m. Police raid a numbers bank on West 145th Street, allegedly acting on an anonymous tip. The raid nets nearly $5,000 in cash and 24 betting slips. Operators believe the tip came from Italian sources seeking to pressure St. Clair's network. The arrested bankers post bail within hours, and the cash mysteriously disappears from the evidence locker. Corruption rumors swirl. Sunday, August 17 to 9:30 a.m., a second body is discovered in the Hudson River near the George Washington Bridge construction site. This victim is a black male, early 20s, shot twice in the head. He is quickly identified as a low-level enforcer for St. Clair. No witnesses, no arrests. The killing is widely interpreted as Italian retaliation, one death answered with another. Sunday, 1 p.m. Stephanie St. Clair issues a rare public statement through a trusted lawyer printed in the Amsterdam News. Harlem's people will not be intimidated. We run our own affairs. The statement does not mention Johnson, Frankie, or the Italians by name, but its meaning is unmistakable. Sunday, 5 p.m., a meeting is convened at an undisclosed location in Midtown Manhattan. Attendees reportedly include representatives from the Luciano organization, the Jewish mob's Meyer-Lansky faction, and neutral Irish intermediaries. The purpose: to assess whether the Harlem conflict will spiral into a broader war that disrupts everyone's business. No public record of the meeting exists, but multiple sources confirm it occurred. Sunday, 11:45 p.m. Bumpy Johnson is spotted at a late-night diner on 125th Street, eating alone, unarmed and unhurried. To those watching, the performance is deliberate. He is not hiding. He is not fleeing. He is daring someone to act. By Monday morning, the city held its breath. 2 men were dead. Harlem's streets were tense, and no one, not the police, not the Italians, not even St. Clair's own people, knew for certain what Bumpy Johnson would do next. To understand why a single insult at a poker table could trigger dismemberment, firebombing, and the threat of all-out war, you must first understand Harlem in 1934 and the two forces colliding over its most profitable underground industry. Side A: Harlem's independent numbers operators. The numbers racket, also known as policy or the numbers game, was Harlem's economic engine during the Great Depression. At its core, the game was a daily lottery. Players bet small amounts, often just pennies or nickels on 3-digit numbers. Winning numbers were determined by various systems, commonly the last 3 digits of the day's total handle at a major racetrack. The odds of winning were roughly 1 in 1,000, but the payout was typically 600 to 1, leaving a substantial margin for the operators. By the early 1930s, the numbers game employed thousands of Harlem residence runners who collected bets door to door, controllers who managed territories, bankers who held the pools and paid out winners. It was a black-owned, black-operated system that generated an estimated millions of dollars annually in a neighborhood where legitimate employment was scarce and segregation barred most residents from white-controlled industries. The numbers game was not merely crime, it was an economy, a lifeline, and a source of community pride. At the top of this system stood figures like Casper Holstein, an elder statesman who had built his fortune in the 1920s and invested in legitimate businesses, and Stephanie St. Clair, a fiercely independent operator known as Queenie, or Madame St. Clair. St. Clair was a legend and immigrant from Martinique who had risen from domestic work to control vast networks of runners and bankers. She was known for refusing to pay protection to anyone, for fighting police corruption, and for defending Harlem's right to self-determination. She did not tolerate disrespect, and she did not negotiate from weakness. Bumpy Johnson was her enforcer, her strategist, and increasingly her public face. Born Ellsworth Raymond Johnson in South Carolina, he had arrived in Harlem as a teenager and quickly earned a reputation for intelligence, ruthlessness, and loyalty. He was not flashy, he was effective. By 1934, he was emerging as the muscle behind St. Clair's empire, the man who ensured debts were paid, rivals were discouraged, and insults were answered. His methods were calculated, his violence purposeful. He did not kill for sport, he killed to send messages. Side B, the Italian syndicate's expansion. On the other side of this conflict stood the Italian American Mafia, specifically the organization controlled by Charles Lucky Luciano. By 1934, Luciano had consolidated power across New York's 5 families, eliminated old-world rivals, and established the framework for what would become the modern American mafia: centralized, corporate, and ruthlessly efficient. Luciano and his associates Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese saw Harlem's numbers racket as an untapped gold mine. They observed millions of dollars flowing through black operators with minimal interference from police, who were often paid off, and virtually no Italian control. To the Italians, this was inefficiency. They believed their superior organization, political connections, and willingness to use overwhelming violence would allow them to take over the Harlem numbers game and multiply its profits. But the Italians underestimated 2 factors. First, Harlem's numbers operators were not disorganized, they were decentralized by choice, difficult to eliminate in a single move. Second, Harlem's residents were fiercely protective of their own. The numbers game was not just an industry, it was a symbol. An Italian takeover would be seen not merely as a business move, but as an invasion, a reassertion of white supremacy in one of the few arenas where black entrepreneurs had achieved autonomy. The tension had been building for years. Italian mobsters had been gradually pressuring smaller operators, offering protection that was really extortion, and occasionally resorting to violence. Some Harlem operators had capitulated. Others, like St. Clair, had resisted. By mid-1934, the conflict was reaching a tipping point. The Italians wanted in, St. Clair wanted them gone, and Bumpy Johnson was the line she drew in the sand. The cultural collision, what made the poker table incident so explosive, was not merely the violence that followed violence, was common in the underworld, but the nature of the insult. When Frankie C used racist language against Johnson, he was not simply being crude. He was asserting a racial hierarchy, implying that no matter how powerful or wealthy Johnson became, he would always be subordinate to white criminals. In a room full of black operators, this was not just an insult to Johnson, it was a challenge to the entire system St. Clair had built. Johnson's response, swift, brutal, public, was a counter-assertion: we are not subordinate, we will not be disrespected, and we will meet your violence with our own. For Luciano and the Italians, Frankie's death presented a dilemma. They could not let the killing go unanswered without appearing weak, but they also could not launch an all-out war without risking enormous costs in lives, in money, and in political heat. A war in Harlem would attract attention from law enforcement, disrupt business, and potentially unite Harlem's operators against a common enemy. For St. Clair and Johnson, the stakes were equally high. They had sent A message, but now they had to defend it. If the Italians retaliated successfully, other operators might lose faith and capitulate. If St. Clair's network appeared vulnerable, the entire structure could collapse. By the third day after the poker game, both sides understood they were playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship. Neither could afford to look weak. Neither could afford a war. And yet, neither could see a clear path to de-escalation. Observers in the underworld watched carefully. Some bet on Italian victory through sheer force. Others believed Harlem's resilience and home field advantage would prevail. A few wise voices whispered that this conflict would not be settled with guns, but with money, negotiation, and the cold calculus of profit. But in the summer of 1934, with two bodies already on the ground and pride on the line, rational calculation was in short supply. To grasp why control of Harlem's numbers racket was worth killing for, consider the economics. The numbers game was, at its core, an elegantly simple system that generated staggering profits with minimal overhead. How the numbers game worked: each day, a player could place a bet on any three-digit number from 0000 to 999. Bets were typically small 5 cents, 10 cents, occasionally a quarter or dollar from higher rollers. A runner, usually a trusted neighborhood figure, would collect bets throughout the morning, recording each wager in a ledger or on betting slips. The runner would then deliver the slips and cash to a controller who managed a specific territory. Controllers reported to bankers, who held the pooled money and were responsible for paying out winners. The winning number was determined by a published, verifiable source to prevent fraud. Most commonly, operators used the last three digits of the total pari-mutuel handle at a major racetrack, printed in the next day's newspapers. This system ensured transparency. Players could verify results independently, which built trust and sustained participation. The mathematics of profit, the true odds of hitting a three-digit number were 1 in 1,000. However, operators typically paid winners at 600 to 1 odds. This gap was the profit margin. Let's consider a simple daily breakdown for a mid-sized numbers bank. Total daily bets collected, $10,000 number of individual bets, approximately 20,000, averaging 50 cents each. Expected winners, statistically, 10 players, total payout at 600 to 1 odds, $6,000 gross profit for the bank, $4,000 per day. From that $4,000, the operator paid commissions. Runners typically kept 25% of the money they collected. Controllers took a percentage, and the bank also paid protection money to corrupt police officers, local politicians, and sometimes rival gangs. After expenses, a successful numbers bank might net $1,500 to $2,000 per day in profit. Over a month, that was $45,000 to $60,000. Annually, a well-run operation could generate $500,000 or more. Multiply this by dozens of independent operators across Harlem, and you begin to understand the scale. Estimates from the era suggest Harlem's total numbers industry generated between $10 and $20 million annually, an astronomical sum during the Great Depression, when the median family income was roughly $1,500 per year. Why the Italians wanted into the Luciano organization? This was an inefficiency. They saw fragmented operators, duplicated overhead, and missed opportunities for consolidation. If the Italians could take control installing their own bankers, controlling the flow of money, and eliminating competition, they believed they could increase profits significantly while reducing risk. Centralized bookkeeping would minimize skimming. Political connections would reduce police interference, and the sheer threat of Italian violence would deter rivals. The Italians also recognized that prohibition was ending. The 21st Amendment, ratified in December 1933, had eliminated the massive profits from illegal alcohol. The mafia needed new revenue streams. Gambling, particularly the numbers game, was the obvious target. Why Harlem resisted, for operators like Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, an Italian takeover meant more than lost profits. It meant surrendering autonomy, becoming employees rather than owners, and allowing white criminals to extract wealth from black communities. It also meant losing the social capital and respect that came with running their own operations. Moreover, many Harlem operators believed they could outlast Italian pressure. They had deep community ties, trusted runners who would not easily switch allegiance, and a decentralized structure that made them difficult to eliminate in a single strike. They also understood that a prolonged war would cost the Italians dearly in attention, money, and bodies. By August 1934, the numbers game was not merely a business. It was the prize in a struggle over power, respect, and the future of organized crime in New York. And Bumpy Johnson had just raised the stakes dramatically. The official response to the dismemberment and the escalating violence was, at best, tepid. The New York Police Department's public stance was one of studied indifference. When pressed by reporters, a precinct captain offered a terse statement: "We are investigating. No suspects at this time." When asked if the killing was connected to the numbers racket, he declined to comment. When asked if police planned increased patrols in Harlem, he replied, "We maintain adequate presence in all neighborhoods." The reality, widely understood but rarely spoken aloud, was that significant portions of the NYPD were on the payroll of one side or another. Numbers operators paid police to ignore their activities, to warn of impending raids, and to arrest competitors. Italian mobsters paid even more, leveraging political connections that reached into City Hall, the district attorney's office, and the judiciary. For a police force already stretched thin by Depression-era budget cuts, the path of least resistance was to let gangsters kill each other and intervene only when civilian casualties or public outcry made inaction untenable. Some officers were genuinely conflicted. A few black patrolmen, rare in the overwhelmingly white NYPD, privately expressed sympathy for Harlem's operators, seeing the numbers game as a necessary economic engine in a community starved of legitimate opportunity. But these voices carried little weight. Institutionally, the police viewed the conflict as a criminal matter best left to burn itself out. Federal authorities were similarly disengaged. The newly empowered FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, was focused on bank robbers and political radicals, not urban gambling wars. The Treasury Department, which had brought down Al Capone on tax evasion charges, showed no interest in pursuing Harlem's numbers operators, perhaps because the sums involved, while large by neighborhood standards, paled in comparison to the bootlegging fortunes of the Prohibition era. Community response: Harlem itself was divided. For many residents, the numbers game was a daily ritual, a small investment that offered hope of a windfall and supported local entrepreneurs. These residents largely sided with operators like St. Clair, viewing them as neighborhood champions standing up to outside exploitation. Others, particularly clergy and reform advocates, saw the numbers racket as a moral scourge, a system that extracted wealth from the poor and encouraged gambling addiction. These voices called for crackdowns, but they lacked political power. Harlem's economic desperation made moral arguments difficult to sustain when the numbers game provided jobs, credit, and occasional windfalls that no legitimate institution offered. Business owners occupied a precarious middle ground. Many relied on numbers. Operators for informal loans and patronage, but they also feared the violence that accompanied the industry. The sight of a dismembered body, even that of a rival gangster, was a stark reminder of the stakes. In the days following Frankie's death, Harlem's streets were tense but not panicked. Residents went about their routines with heightened awareness. Numbers runners continued their morning collections, though some territories saw reduced activity. Churches held prayer vigils. The Amsterdam News published editorials calling for peace while also defending Harlem's right to self-determination. The prevailing sentiment was not fear but wariness. Harlem had survived violence before. The question now was whether this violence would escalate into something larger, something that would consume the neighborhood in a war it did not choose. As the third day after the poker game ended and Monday's dawn approached, analysts of the underworld, bookmakers, lawyers, corrupt cops, and rival gangsters debated three possible outcomes. Scenario 1, retreat. In this scenario, the Italians absorb the loss of Frankie C and choose not to escalate. They calculate that a war in Harlem would be costly, both in blood and in political attention. Luciano and his associates decide that the numbers game, while profitable, is not worth the risk of uniting Harlem's operators against them or triggering a federal crackdown. They issue no further threats. They pull back their soldiers. The killing of St. Clair's enforcer is written off as a face-saving gesture, and the conflict freezes in an uneasy stalemate. Why this is plausible: the Italians are pragmatic businessmen. If the costs outweigh the benefits, they move on to easier targets. Why this costs them: retreat damages their reputation. Other operators across the city would see weakness. Future expansion efforts would meet stiffer resistance. Scenario 2. Negotiated settlement. In this scenario, intermediaries, possibly Meyer-Lansky, who maintained better relations with black and Jewish operators, or neutral Irish mobsters, broker a deal. The Italians receive a percentage of Harlem's numbers profits in exchange for leaving St. Clair's core operations intact. Bumpy Johnson is neither arrested nor killed, but agrees to a symbolic gesture, perhaps a payment to Frankie's family, or a pledge to avoid further public violence. Why this is plausible: both sides have an interest in stability. A negotiated truce allows everyone to profit without the chaos of war. Why this costs them: St. Clair surrenders a measure of autonomy, and the Italians accept less than total control. Both sides would spin the deal as victory, but insiders would know it was compromise born of mutual fear. Scenario 3, all-out escalation. In this scenario, the Italians respond to Frankie's death with overwhelming force. They target not just Johnson, but St. Clair's entire network, killing bankers, intimidating runners, bombing headquarters. St. Clair and Johnson fight back with ambushes, assassinations, and appeals to community solidarity. The war drags on for weeks or months, attracting media coverage, federal scrutiny, and massive casualties on both sides. Why this is plausible: pride and reputation matter in the underworld. Neither side can afford to look weak. Why this cost them: war is expensive, police crackdowns intensify, profits plummet, and even the victor emerges weakened, vulnerable to opportunistic rivals. By Monday morning, no one knew which scenario would unfold, but everyone knew the clock was ticking. Then, late Sunday night, just hours before our script went to press, a development changed the calculus once again. According to multiple sources, a fourth body was discovered in the basement of an abandoned tenement on East 116th Street, deep in Italian East Harlem. The victim was identified as a mid-level Luciano associate, a collector known for strong-arming independent operators. He had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style, and left in a kneeling position, a deliberate, theatrical display. No one claimed responsibility, no witnesses emerged, but the message was unmistakable. If the Italians wanted escalation, they would get it on both sides of the territorial line. The killing shattered the illusion that Harlem's operators were playing defense. Someone widely believed to be Johnson or his associates had taken the war into Italian territory, demonstrating capability, reach, and willingness to match violence with violence. Police response was swift but predictable. A dozen officers raided several Harlem locations, arresting low-level runners on minor charges, but making no effort to apprehend Johnson himself. The raids were widely interpreted as theater, a show of action designed to appease political pressure without actually resolving the conflict. For Luciano, the fourth body created an impossible situation. To retaliate again would guarantee all-out war. To stand down would signal weakness at a moment when his organization was consolidating power across the city. To negotiate would require him to treat Johnson and St. Clair as equals, an ideological concession he had long resisted. And so, as Monday morning arrived, the city braced for a decision: retaliation, negotiation, or an uneasy, blood-soaked stalemate. By noon on Monday, August 20th, 1934, 5 men are dead. 2 neighborhoods are on edge, and the most powerful criminal organizations in New York are locked in a high-stakes staring contest where the next move could determine the future of organized crime in Harlem and perhaps the city itself. Bumpy Johnson has not been seen in public since Sunday's diner appearance. Stephanie St. Clair has made no further statements. The Luciano organization has issued no threats and made no arrests. Unusual silence for men who typically advertise their power. Behind closed doors, intermediaries are reportedly shuttling between midtown offices and Harlem backrooms, carrying proposals, testing positions, and searching for an exit that allows both sides to claim victory. But the window for negotiation is narrow. Every hour that passes without resolution increases the pressure on both sides to act, to prove strength, to answer insult with violence. Neighborhood residents go about their business with one eye on the street. Numbers runners make their morning collections but move faster, linger less, and avoid certain corners. Beat cops patrol in pairs, hands near their holsters, unsure whether they will be witnesses, participants, or casualties if the situation explodes. The question is no longer whether Bumpy Johnson was justified in his response to a racist insult at a poker table. That debate ended when Frankie's body appeared in 3 pieces. The question now is simpler and far more dangerous. Who controls Harlem? By Wednesday, we will have an answer. The city waits, the dealers shuffle. And somewhere in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson is deciding whether to sit down at the table or flip it over entirely. The deadline approaches.